All right, so today we are covering week 15 of our series Beloved, the life and writings of the Apostle John. And we can tell that we're getting close to the end of the gospel because today we're looking at John's account of the cross. Now, while all four gospels cover the story of Jesus' arrest and crucifixion, they're all just a little bit different, right? When we read them, we notice that the major parts are the same. However, each gospel gives some unique details about that day. And John's gospel is no different. In fact, chapter 18 opens with a really unique detail that is like a blink and you miss it kind of detail. And that's in John 18:1. Someone? Nope.
When he had finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side there was a garden, and he and his disciples went into it.
Now, when we last got together, we covered John chapter 17, which Jesus prayed over the upcoming events. Well, over the cross, he prayed over his disciples, and he prayed over us as well. So chapter 18 opens up right on the heels of this prayer and says that after Jesus finished, him and the disciples, they crossed the Kidron Valley to get to the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, one of the major features of the Kidron Valley is that in Jesus' day, there was a stream that crossed through it and actually flowed out of Jerusalem. In fact, some of the Bible versions actually translate this to the Kidron Brook rather than the Kidron Valley, just because of that feature. Now, the stream's purpose was basically drainage away from the city. But the thing that's really important about detail about this is that there's a channel from the altar and the temple that fed into this stream. So what this means was for this Passover holiday, all the blood from the lambs that were sacrificed for the Passover meal would have drained from the temple and would have been flowing into that stream that night. So when Jesus and his disciples crossed the Kidron Brook, it would have absolutely still been running red with the blood of thousands of sacrificial lambs. And needless to say, this just foreshadows what's going to happen on the cross. It's a really interesting picture to think about when they left the city and they traveled to the Garden of Gethsemane to see that brook filled with all the lamb's blood. And we know what happened in that garden, right? Judas and the Roman soldiers met Jesus and they arrested him. And we see this in John 18:2 through 3.
Now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place because Jesus had often met there with the disciples. So Judas came to the garden, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons.
Now, real cool detail here, right? We find it in John's gospel. It says Judas knew exactly where to look because this was a place Jesus would often take his disciples. The Garden of Gethsemane would overlook the city, and it was probably a really peaceful place to just go up there and reflect and pray. But this night, we know there's no peace, right? This night, there was an army marching up. And we see Judas show up with what's described as a detachment of soldiers. Now, usually when we see the scene of Judas and the Roman soldiers marching up the hill in dramas and movies, it's Judas and just kind of like a handful of people, right? But that's not quite accurate because the word detachment here translates to a Roman cohort, which meant 200, 600, or even 1,000 soldiers. And if that wasn't enough manpower for the night, they also brought a battalion of the temple police and some of the temple officials as well. John said that the crowd was carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons with them. That's because they were expecting one of two outcomes, right? We have to keep in mind that the Jewish mindset for the Messiah was he was a militaristic leader. So they believed the Messiah was going to lead a military campaign. The first way they thought this night was going to go down was that there was going to be a large fight, that this army was going to meet some major resistance at the top of the hill. Or the second way they thought it was going to go down was that they were going to catch Jesus and his followers by complete surprise and possibly send them fleeing into the olive groves and caves that are littered throughout that area. And that's where the torches would have came in very handy in case they had to search and hunt them down that night, right? But what Judas and the soldiers did not anticipate was scenario number 3, which is what happened. And we see that in John 18:4 through 6.
Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" Jesus of Nazareth, they replied. "I am he," Jesus said, and Judas the traitor was standing there with them. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground.
Now, in most translations, Jesus' response is translated as I am he. But the actual Greek words that were used is ego, eimi, which translates to I am. Now, in the Bible, we know the significance of this statement, right? I am, because in the Old Testament with Moses at the burning bush, when God called him to free the Israelites, Moses asked God, what's your identity? Who are you? And Moses said, who should I say is sending me? And God replies to Moses, I am who I am. Meaning, I am self-existent. I am the creator. I am the only. I am the one who is, who was, and who will always be. Which is where we get the name Yahweh from. It means he who brings into existence. In John's gospel, we also see the significance of the words I am. Jesus had 7 I am statements which showed his identity and showed his divinity. And we reviewed these over the previous weeks, but just as a refresher, Jesus said, I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the gate. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. And last but not least, Jesus said, I am the true vine. See, these words, I am, from Jesus' lips, they were just as hallowed. They were just as powerful. They were just as significant as these words that were at the burning bush. And we'll see these power in those words from Jesus in these verses. But first, I want to make sure that we understand what's happening here, right? In the garden, Satan gathered an army to march up that hill and arrest the Son of God to lead him to his death. The enemy seemed like he was in total control. But at the top of that hill, Jesus stops them as soon as they approach, and he takes control of the situation by asking, who are you looking for? And out of all the names and out of all the titles for Jesus, they reply what is probably the most demeaning one, Jesus of Nazareth. AKA Jesus from that little backwater village. Jesus from that insignificant speck. Jesus from that place where nothing good comes from. Jesus of Nazareth. But Jesus doesn't take that title with reproach, dismay, or disapproval. Many people may be ashamed of where their roots or where they come from and dislike being identified and associated with that, but not Jesus. Jesus chose those humble beginnings. Jesus embraced the poor and the despised of society throughout his ministry, and Jesus was unapologetic for it. So the reality is Christ took that title, Jesus of Nazareth, that was meant to demean him and diminish him, but instead Jesus wore that title like the crown, like the true king that he is. So when his army says they're looking for Jesus of Nazareth, Christ replied, ego, eimi, I am. And the Gospel of John tells us that those words from Jesus' lips were enough to cause those hundreds of soldiers, cause that battalion of guards, cause that handful of officials, and cause that one traitor to draw back and even fall all over themselves. That's how powerful those words were. The reality of the situation was that Satan could have brought the might and force of the whole Roman army with him that night. Satan could have thrown in all the temple guards that night. Satan could have brought the entire political power of the Sanhedrin, even the emperor himself that night, but it would have not been enough to arrest Jesus. No force on earth would have been enough to arrest Jesus. The only way they took him that night was because he let them. Jesus peacefully surrendered. Now, just a side note, Jesus might have been peaceful, but that doesn't mean the entire situation was peaceful and perfect, right? We see this in John 18, 10 through 11.
Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Jesus commanded Peter, put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?
Peter was in a true act of impulse, right? And he took a sword and he cut off the right ear, not of a Roman soldier, but instead he attacked one of the temple servants. Since it's likely Peter is right-handed, this would have meant that Peter would have struck the man from behind in order to cut his right ear off. This isn't exactly the bravest action, nor the smartest action, because they were significantly outnumbered. But Peter was just reacting to his surroundings with the best way he knew how. And I wonder how many times we find ourselves in a situation like that too, right? In our life, we're exactly like that. The situation looks really dire, but in reality, God has it completely under control. But instead of letting God work through the situation, we start running in and slashing ears, right? We feel the need to do something. We really don't know what to do, so we just start swinging. Then God has to tell us to knock it off because we're detouring him from the situation. And now he has to go and clean up the mess that we made. The reality was that Peter's plan was absolutely terrible, right? It had no shot, but it felt like he had to do something. Many times we react the same way in those situations, but we need to remember, put the sword away. Remember, God has a plan, and sometimes we just have to be still and trust in it. We have to let God work through it, even though we don't like where that situation's going. And Peter definitely did not like where that situation was going, right? Because next, John tells us that Jesus was led to court to Annas, who was not the high priest, but he was the father-in-law of the high priest Caiaphas. Now, this makes sense that Jesus was led to Annas when we realize who Annas was. He was a high priest from 6 to 15 AD. And through those last 15 years or so, from his last reign to when Jesus' time, he left the position to his 4 sons in that office, and now it belonged to his son-in-law Caiaphas. Once upon a time in the Old Testament, the position of a high priest, it was a lifelong position. It was sacred, right? But just like most powerful positions, they get corrupt. And in Jesus' day, this position of the high priest was strictly political. Caiaphas may have held the title of the high priest, but he was the figurehead in the temple. The reality was Annas was the one who was the real power behind the position. And that's why Jesus was brought to him first. And we see that in John 18, 15 through 17.
Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. But Peter had to wait outside at the door. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back, spoke to the servant girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. "You aren't one of those men's disciples too, are you?" she asked Peter. He replied, "I am not."
Now we know the disciples scattered in Jesus' arrest, right? But we also know that Peter must have doubled back at some point because he was there for at least part of the trial to deny him. But here in John 18, verse 15, we learned that it wasn't only Peter that was there. There was a second disciple who was there as well. And the other disciple was known in the courtyard and was able to get them access into this trial. Now, scholars suggest that this other disciple was the Apostle John. And much of this is based on evidence in John's Gospel, which points to that. Now, fair warning, right? Nothing in the scriptures has any mention of John or any other disciple, for that matter, having a connection to this high priest's court. However, we can notice in John's Gospel, and only in John's Gospel, that he names the servant who Peter cut the ear off of, Malchus. And this points to John knowing that man who Peter attacked. On top of that, in Peter's third denial, John points to the fact that the accuser to Peter is actually a relative of Malchus, so the man that Peter attacked. And this indicates that John not only knew Malchus, but he also knew some of the family as well. He had an intimate connection. Now, because of this familiarity, we see John walk right into Annas' court for Jesus' trial. But because Peter's very unfamiliar with it, he's hanging back and waiting outside the door, right? So John tells the servant girl, "Go get him." Now, when she speaks to Peter, there's 2 little words in Greek that are important. It's kai su, which means and you. She approaches Peter and says, "Oh, you are also his disciple." That means the servant girl was aware of John's discipleship. But in this moment, she regarded it very little, right? In fact, her attitude towards Peter is, "Oh, are you another one of them? Are you another one of the guys that are with this guy that got arrested?" And here's where we see Peter's first denial. We don't know why he denies Jesus here the first time. It could be that maybe he was still in hacking earlobes mode and he wasn't giving it much thought, he was just reacting. It could be that he was uncomfortable, maybe even fearful walking into that court. It could be Peter trusting his instincts because he identified how hostile this situation was and went into self-preservation mode. But either way, it doesn't matter the reason. Jesus' prediction of Peter denying him 3 times started in that moment. And then we see Annas' interrogation of Jesus, and we see that in John 19 through 24.
Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about spoken openly to the world, Jesus replied. I always taught in synagogues or at the temple, where all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said. When Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby slapped him in the face. Is this the way you answer the high priest? He demanded. If I said something wrong, Jesus replied, testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me? Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest.
See, Annas starts his questioning Jesus about his doctrine and his disciples. The attitude here, the attitude here is basically, tell us what you're guilty of and identify all of those who are guilty with you so we can have justice. Now, I'm not sure if any of you have been much of a hooligan as I was in my life, but if you had to appear once or twice in court to defend yourself, you would know that that is not the way a trial is actually supposed to go, right? You're not supposed to be pronounced guilty and then asked to prove it. Even in the Jewish trials back then, in Jesus' day, the first thing they were supposed to do was call forth witnesses and establish the crime that was committed. Before they actually accused anything, they had to have that burden of proof that there was a crime. So Jesus' reply to Annas here, where he points out that there should be plenty of witnesses to what he taught, was not Jesus being uncooperative, but rather it was Jesus reminding them of their own rules. Jesus says that he doesn't have secret doctrine. What he taught was open and to the public, and surely there would be witnesses to hear what he taught that they could bring forth and question and establish what was going on. In response, one of the officials open-handedly slapped Jesus in the face for saying this. And in this moment, the violence began that night. It was a starting point. Why? Because they didn't have an answer to the injustice that they were doing. They didn't have an answer, so they responded with violence to silence the question. And the sad reality is, they will continue to respond this way. They will continue their injustice. They will continue to escalate the violence until it results in death. What we see here that night at the start, Jesus calls it out. He says to Annas, he says, if I said something wrong, tell me. But if I spoke the truth, why strike me? And it's very important to notice Annas' reaction to this, right? His answer. There isn't one. He doesn't answer the question. Instead, he ignores it. And he bounds Jesus like a criminal and just sends him down the line to Caiaphas. There's an object lesson here, right, if we're paying attention. Annas' silence spoke volumes. The reality is, Annas had the power to stop all of this, right? His word held political power. It held weight. He would have influence not only over Caiaphas, but probably over a good part of the Sanhedrin as well. And even if Annas called for this trial to be fair, or even if he called out the violence when it first started and said to his official, hey, listen, there's no need to do all that. Or even if Annas just answered Jesus honestly to his question on what he did wrong. Everything that night could have been different. But Annas instead, he was silent. And his silence played the part in this vicious cycle. And the object lesson for us is when it comes to evil, when it comes to sin, when it comes to injustice, silence matters, right? Our words have power too. Our words have power to stop cycles. It has power to break chains. And our silence can let that evil perpetrate and even escalate. And this moment, or in reality, this lack of the moment, made all the difference that night. And as Jesus is getting taken away, we see something else going on. We see John around the fire with Peter. And this is where Peter denies Jesus 2 more times. And that's in John 18:25 through 27.
Meanwhile, Simon Peter was standing there warming himself. So they asked him, aren't you one of those disciples too? Are you? He denied it, saying, I am not. One of the priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter cut off, challenged him. Didn't I see you in the garden? Again, Peter denied it, and at that moment, a rooster began to crow.
Now, I've never been in this position, but I would say that if somebody slashes your family member's ear off in front of you, you're not likely to forget their face, right? Especially if it just happened a couple hours ago. So they had Peter trapped in his lie, but he does what many do when they're caught in a lie. He lied harder, right? Some of the other gospels say that Peter actually stood up and he cursed and he swore to further try to accent his denial. But this was the third denial. and that rooster crowed. And it was at that moment Peter knew that he failed. Not necessarily a failure of his faith, but a failure in his courage to be able to walk that faith out, which is something he never thought would have been possible for him. But John was there for it. He was there to witness it. John got to witness this moment of Peter's failure firsthand. But the beautiful part is later in John's gospel, after the resurrection, John also gets to witness the redemption of Peter, which we'll cover next week. Now, in these verses, John tells us that Jesus goes to Caiaphas, but John doesn't actually record any part of that in the trial. We know from the other Gospels that Jesus went to Caiaphas, he went to Pilate, then he got sent to Herod, and then back to Pilate. But John doesn't record any of that either. The next thing John records is Jesus with Pilate before the sentence. Now, to me, this points to the idea that maybe John wasn't there during some of those parts, right? To me, it's possible maybe after Peter's failure, he also needed a moment to step away and recollect his thoughts and his courage during this process. But John also could have taken that opportunity to go find Mary and the other women to let them know what was going on. We really don't know if John was there for Caiaphas and for Herod and what he was doing. But what we do know is that John was there for the last part with Pilate. And he was certainly there to hear Pilate struggle with all of this. Now we know that the Jewish leaders pronounced Jesus guilty until proven innocent. But Pilate, he wasn't buying any of that, right? What Pilate asks the religious leaders is what Jesus has done to be brought to him. And they kind of dance around that subject with him. So Pilate pulls Jesus aside and he has a conversation one-on-one with him to try to understand what's going on. And we see that in John 18:33 through 38.
Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews? Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked. "Or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it you have done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king then," said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came to this world is to testify to the church. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." "What is truth?" retorted Pilate. With this he went out again to the Jews gathered there and said, "I find no basis for charge against him."
Now we have to understand that Pilate has dealt with plenty of insurrectionists, terrorists, and people who claim to call themselves king overthrowers. There's plenty of anarchy that was during this time period. You not only had the religious extremists known as the Zealots trying to take down Rome, but you had many people who were hungry for power and trying to lead the people out from under the Roman thumb. The historian Josephus actually talked about this period of time. He said after the death of Herod, the first Herod, in 4 BC, anybody with a band of rebels would attempt to try to make themselves king during this time period. So yeah, Pilate dealt with plenty of people who were not afraid to steal, kill, and accomplish their agenda by any means. In fact, Pilate had one of them in his custody at this time named Barabbas, a thief and a murderer who raised his fist against Rome. Pilate also dealt with many of these people that would try to call themselves kings. And he knew their type, right? They had a stereotype. They would be arrogant. They would be rebellious. They would be ready to spit in his face and die for the cause. Or they would be sullen and they'd be distraught because their delusion, their little bubble, got popped. It was over. Jesus was none of these. Jesus was calm. He was peaceful. He was even confident. Pilate questions Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus asks him what the context is. He's asking Pilate, "Are you questioning for yourself? Are you asking me if I'm a political king to overthrow Caesar? If so, the answer is no." But if Pilate is asking in the Jewish context if Jesus is the promised Messiah king that the scriptures pointed to, then the answer is yes. The reality is all Pilate knows of kingdoms are massive armies and political power. But Jesus tells him, "My kingdom, it's not that." Right? In fact, my kingdom is not even of this world. If my kingdom was now, you wouldn't have got to this point, because I was born to be a king to testify the truth. And this is where Pilate reports with the infamous, "What is truth?" This is Pilate's way of just dismissing the conversation, because Pilate sees no political threat with Jesus. But today we ask a lot of the same question, right? What is truth? Today people really don't believe in an absolute truth. They believe that truth is personalized and individualized, and each person has their very own truth. That there's your truth, there's my truth, but even if they're very different, they can somehow, some way, both be correct and important and even equal, right? We know inherently that this idea doesn't make any sense. In fact, it completely defeats the concept of truth. Because truth is truth. Truth does not bend. It doesn't waver. Truth is not flexible. It doesn't differ. It doesn't contradict itself. And if truth did any of these things, it has a different definition. And it's called a lie. There's only one truth. And it's God's word. And it's indicated in the birth, the life, and the death of Jesus Christ. That's not our truth. That is the truth. And that was what Jesus was born to bring to us. Now, even though Pilate is questioning what is truth, he knows some of it, right? He knows that Jesus is innocent, but he wants this crowd to come to the same conclusion as him. Pilate first offers to free a prisoner. He presents a choice between Jesus and Barabbas. The Gospel of Matthew tells us the religious leaders incite the crowd to choose Barabbas. And everyone knows that this is a completely illogical and foolish choice, right? What we get lost is that Barabbas' name sounds like the phrase, Son of the Father. And it's ironic in this moment that people chose a violent, false Son of the Father over Jesus. But the terrifying reality is that people will choose another false, violent Son of the Father, named the Antichrist, over Jesus one of these days, right? We realize that evil doesn't have to follow logic to be effective. And here Pilate learned that lesson as well with the prisoner exchange. Pilate went to his next step. He had Jesus scourged and mocked to try to please the crowd. The soldiers whipped Christ violently, and in the process, they ripped his back and they ripped his body to shreds. These soldiers put a purple robe on him and fashioned a crown of thorns that they put on his head. And they dressed him up in royalty to mock Christ, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." I want you to realize with this crown of thorns, though, that there are many crowns in this world that have been bought with blood. But none of them are more important than the crown of thorns that adorned Jesus' head that day. Now, immediately, it would have been very hard to tell in that moment because Jesus certainly did not look like royalty. Pilate presented Jesus, this beaten, bloody, broken man, to the people with the hope that they would do the right thing and they would have mercy on him. But instead, the chief priests and the officials yell, "Crucify." And this is where the crowd starts to get behind it. Pilate then turns around and tells the Jews to try Jesus under their own laws. But then they retort, they can't crucify him under their own laws. And Jesus deserves this death because he claimed to be the Son of God. This is the first time Pilate heard it. This revelation strikes Pilate because he couldn't figure out Jesus before this claim to divinity. But now it starts to make some sense to him, right? Pilate would have not been able to fully understand Jesus because his identity of divinity would have been defined by Roman myths. But Pilate still would have understood that Jesus had power and he had authority and he must have possessed this. And Pilate sensed this, and he sensed that it was true because the next verses tell us that Pilate became very afraid. And we see this in John 19, 8 through 11.
When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid, and he went back inside the palace. "Where do you come from?" he asked Jesus. But Jesus gave him no answer. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. "Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin."
We see Pilate desperate in this situation, right? He asked Jesus, "Where did you come from?" But Jesus already answered that earlier, right? He says, "My kingdom's not from here." Pilate isn't looking for actual answers. He knows the answers. He's trying to get Jesus to speak up and get himself out of this. Pilate even threatens Jesus to get this answer. "Don't you realize that I have the power over you? I have the power for life or death?" This is funny because Pilate doesn't have a clue what power means, right? The reality is Pilate is a very weak man. The entire time, Pilate had the chance to free Jesus, but he didn't because the crowd had power over him. Pilate defers to the crowd for the judgment. He defers to the crowd for the prisoner choice. He defers to the crowd whether the beating Jesus endured was enough. And now he's deferring to the crowd for the death sentence of a man that he said plainly, I can find no fault in. Pilate holds no power. But Jesus shows Pilate where power comes from. He says, you would have no power over me if it wasn't given to you from above. Pilate, the crowd, the religious leaders, even Satan himself, all believe in their minds that they have the power over the situation. But the reality is the only one with power, the only one in control was the Father. And Jesus makes that point to all of them very clear. Pilate continues to try to set Jesus free, but the crowd questions Pilate's patriotism and his loyalty to Caesar. And we see that in John 19:12.
From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jewish leaders kept shouting, if you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar.
The title Caesar in Roman culture, it not only made the person emperor, but it also set them on the level of God. What the Jews were accusing Jesus of with these titles of King of the Jews and Son of God threatened both aspects of Caesar. Pilate did not see Jesus as a political threat, but he sees Jesus enough to believe his divinity. This places Pilate in a very difficult situation. Now, in my view, Pilate is not very used to difficult situations. I say this because history tells us that Pilate got this comfy position not because he earned it, but because he married Claudia Procula, who was the granddaughter of Caesar Augustus. This was a move that catapulted Pilate's political career. Now, at this point, Caesar Augustus has been long out of the picture, and the current emperor Tiberius both exiled Claudia and reconciled her prior to this event. And this tells us that the title and privilege that her and Pilate enjoyed is on very shaky ground, to say the least. All Pilate needed was a riot, a question of his loyalty, or anything major to get back on Tiberius' bad side. And that comfy position, that lifestyle, would certainly vanish, maybe along with his head. Who knows? Pilate knew all of this, and he knew at this point he had to make his decision to appease the crowd and hand Jesus over to them to be crucified. And we see that in John 19:13 through 15.
When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the Stone Pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about noon. Here's your king. Excuse me. Here's your king, Pilate said to the Jews. They shouted, take him away, crucify him. Shall I crucify your king? Pilate asked. We have no king but Caesar, the chief priests answered.
Now, trivia moment, Gabbatha means an elevated seat, right? Meaning that this was the judgment seat that Pilate sat on when he made the decision to literally wash his hands of the situation. Pilate makes one last-ditch effort and presents Jesus as the Jewish king, but the crowd claims only loyalty to Caesar. And this is very weird, right, if you think about it, because keep in mind, a very short time ago, the crowd freed a terrorist named Barabbas. So they both chose a revolutionary and swore allegiance to Caesar, probably within the same hour, right? This is a contradiction. It's confusion. It's deception. And that paints a great picture on how the enemy works to accomplish his goals. We can get so focused on our feelings, on our self-ambition, and so focused on our sin that we put on blinders to everything else, and it just blurs. The reality, everything surrounding our focus is important and therefore doesn't have to make sense, just as long as the end result is what we want to get. Jesus' arrest, his trial, his crime that he was accused of, even his death sentence, truly didn't make any sense, but it didn't have to. What doesn't make sense is that the cross was probably originally prepared for Barabbas to hang on that day instead of the spotless, sinless, innocent Jesus that got nailed to it instead. It doesn't make sense that Jesus would suffer and die while the one deserving that penalty walked free. And even though the forces of evil worked in the darkness, worked in the confusion, and worked in the deception to try to destroy the Son of God, we know as Christians what the enemy meant for evil, God can work it into good, right? God can work it into good for those who are called according to his purpose. And God's purpose wasn't just for Jesus to stand in place of Barabbas and pay the penalty for his sin. God's purpose was for Jesus to go to that cross and stand in place for everyone, for all of us, to bear the weight and the penalty for all of us. Creation was originally made absent of sin. It was perfection, but we chose to bring that sin to creation. Since the beginning, sin had a cost. It separated us from God, and it destroyed his perfect creation. God gave reconciliation by allowing animals to stand as a substitution for our guilt, to pay the penalty for us. That this was only a temporary covering. That blood, that life given, could only go so far, and it can only cover so much. Jesus was born to be that Lamb of God, who was slain, who shed his blood to be enough to cover once and for all. Jesus on a cross stood as that perfect substitute, not only for Barabbas, but for everybody who stands guilty, for all whose sin separates them from God. He stood in place for all of us. And we see this moment of the crucifixion take place in John 19, 16 through 22. Oh, yeah, I'm reading it because it's a four-parter. It says, finally Pilate handed him over to be crucified. So the soldiers took charge of Jesus. Carrying his own cross, he went out to the place called the Skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. There they crucified him with two others, one on each side, and Jesus in the middle. Pilate had a notice prepared and fastened to the cross. It read, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Many of the Jews read this sign, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and the sign was written in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. The chief priest of the Jews protested to Pilate, do not write King of the Jews. But that is what the man claimed to be, the King of the Jews. Pilate answered, what I have written, I have written. We have to understand that the cross is a criminal's death. It's Roman custom to write the crime that was committed and fasten it to the cross. So when people looked out, they knew the reason why this person was put to death. The only thing Pilate could write in the situation was Jesus of Nazareth was King of the Jews. Jesus of Nazareth, the dismissive, demeaning title the religious leaders used in reference to Christ to get those Roman soldiers to go up the hill so that he could be arrested. That title, Jesus of Nazareth, was now proclaimed as their king. Pilate could find no crime in Jesus. His only choice was to write who Jesus was. Once the sentence was publicly announced, Roman law forbade it to be changed. And it's ironic that here, Pilate finally found the courage to stand up to the religious leaders, but it's a little bit too little, too late. The words Pilate used were written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, so the crucifixion could be as public as possible. Pilate may not have known it at the time, but it foreshadowed the message of the cross, transcending languages, transcending cultures, transcending boundaries, and the message of the cross truly becoming a global message that not only went out to the entire world, but changed the entire world. And this message of the cross starts with the witnesses, in particular the ones who were there standing at the foot. And we see that in John 19, 25 through 27.
Near the cross of Jesus stood his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother there and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to her, woman, here is your son. And to the disciple, here is your mother. From that time on, the disciple took her into his home.
So John and the four women, many of whom are the same women that will later visit Jesus' tomb and find it empty, are standing there at the foot of the cross, watching Jesus die on that cross. Now, we explored the anatomy of a cross before, right? The anatomy of a crucifixion, so we know the brutality of it. But what blows my mind is that Jesus is there, and despite being beaten, bloody, and suffering, he looks down from the cross And his concern isn't for what he's going through, but his concern is over those who are watching him, in particular, his mother Mary. Now, I can't imagine Mary's thoughts or feelings here, right? No matter how old Jesus is, he's still a little boy at heart, right? Mary wasn't taken by surprise of all this. She knew it would come to this, but nothing could prepare her for this moment. If you turn to Luke chapter 2, which continues the birth story of Jesus, we see Mary and Joseph take baby Jesus to the temple for his dedication, and a righteous man named Simeon speaks a prophecy over Jesus and Mary. And that's in Luke 2:34 through 35.
Then Simeon blessed them and said to Mary, his mother, "This child is destined to cause the falling and rising of many in Israel, and to be a sign that will be spoken against, so that the thoughts of many hearts will be revealed, and the sword will pierce your own soul too."
I'm sure standing at this cross, Mary now feels that piercing of that sword in her soul. She's losing her firstborn son right before her eyes. Her son's in great pain, and there's nothing she can do about it. Jesus sees this, and he knows. So Jesus turns to John. He says, "John, here is your mother. You need to take care of her." Before that, I believe that Jesus, in his infinite wisdom, knew that John's brother James would be martyred in his faith in the next 10 years. He would be beheaded as an example by political powers to try to slow the growth of this young church. Jesus knew that John would eventually have this giant hole in his heart too. Jesus turns to Mary and he says, "Mary, here's your son. Take care of him. Take care of each other." Jesus still asks us, he asks his church to do the same thing today, to take care of each other, to be there for each other, to lift each other up, and to be family for one another. After this moment, John records the last moments of Jesus on the cross in John 19:20 through 30.
Later, knowing that everything had now been finished, and so that scripture would be fulfilled, Jesus said, "I am thirsty."
Oh, you just had 28?
That's what you gave me.
Whoops. Okay, so Jesus says, "I am thirsty." It says a jar of wine vinegar was there. So they soaked a sponge up in it, put the sponge on a stalk of the hyssop plant, and lifted it to Jesus' lips. When he received the drink, Jesus said, "It is finished." And with that, he bowed his head and he gave up his spirit. Now earlier, the soldiers offered Jesus a drink of wine with gall and myrrh mixed into it, which actually would have helped Jesus ease the pain of the cross. But Jesus refused that. He refused this temptation. He refused that easy way out. And when he did that, the soldiers mocked Jesus and offered him vinegar instead, but they wouldn't let him drink. But now Jesus knew that he was at the end, and he knew he had one last thing to say. So he asked for that drink, so that way he can get the last words out clearly. This time, the soldiers did offer him that vinegar, and this fulfilled two psalms. It fulfilled Psalm 22:15 that said, "My mouth is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. You lay me in the dust of death." And it also fulfills Psalm 69:21 that says, "They put gall in my food and gave me vinegar for my thirst." See, these soldiers, they soaked up that vinegar in a sponge and they fed it to Jesus on the stalk of the hyssop plant. And hyssop is very significant in the Bible because it's mentioned several times in the Old Testament. It was part of the sacrifice that the priests used to purify people when they were healed of a skin disease like leprosy. Hyssop was also part of the red heifer sacrifice that the priest did to purify the nation and purify the temple and rededicate it all to God. But what's most important, in my opinion, is to realize that hyssop is first mentioned in the Bible during Passover. This is the plant that the Israelites used to paint the blood of the lamb over their doorposts in Egypt to protect them from the final plague, the final judgment, the angel of death. So it's not a coincidence here that hyssop is used here in the last moments when the blood of Jesus covered our lives and sheltered us from the judgment and death we deserve. Now when Jesus took that drink, he cried out, "Tetelestai," which translates to, "It is finished." But these words go beyond that, right? it's not a reference to a finished work, it's a reference to a completely finished work. It means everything's been fulfilled. There's nothing else that can be done. There's nothing else that needs to be done. It is finished. The phrase changed everything. And we know that a phrase can absolutely do that, right? The words not guilty change everything in the court of law. The words fair can change the dynamic of a game. The words yes to a marriage proposal changes your life. The words goodbye in a relationship sometimes can change that forever. A single word or phrase can change an entire life. But these words, it is finished, Jesus changed the entire history. The work the Father had for the Son to save creation and redeem all mankind was completed. We see Jesus give up his spirit, because just like those soldiers that marched up the hill to arrest him, death didn't even have the power to take that from him. Only Jesus had the power to lay his life down. And when Jesus gave up his spirit, he bowed his head. But this wasn't bowing your head in defeat. This was bowing your head in peace. In peace, because the promises and the prophecies, they were finished. The sacrifices, the ceremonies, they were finished. The perfect obedience to the Father, it was finished. The satisfaction of God's justice, it was finished. The power of Satan, the power of sin, the power of death had over us, it was finished. Jesus' work was finished, and our Savior could finally bow his head in peace. I want to end tonight with a reflection, right? We all know the story of the cross. Usually, it's a huge focus only during the Easter season, but otherwise, it's not in the front and center of our mind all the time. As a Christian, we can be very guilty of not focusing on the cross daily, but rather just reserving it to a passing thought in our mind. I can promise you for the early church that the cross was not a passing thought, especially to those that stood at its feet, especially to those that spent years or even their entire lives with the man that hung from him, especially those who saw the holes in his hand and feet afterwards. The cross and the message of the cross was a daily focus of the church. Now, we might not be firsthand witnesses, right? But we're still witnesses because we know the impact that the cross has in our life. We cannot lose sight of it. For the cross needs to be the forefront and the center, not only of our faith, but of our life. Without the cross, there is nothing. And through the cross, there is everything. The entire Old Testament points to this moment, and the entire New Testament reflects back onto it. The cross is that important to be the center of God's Word. So that means it has to be the center of our lives as well. So does our past, does our Old Testament lead up to the point where we accepted Jesus in our life? Does our testimony point the way? And do we use it? Do we use our past to relate to people who are going through the same thing and also help them point them to the cross? And does our life now, our New Testament, reflect our salvation? When people see us, do they see Christ in us? Do they see us living for Jesus? Do we reflect God's love and hope? Is our life different than it was before the cross? Is our life different than those around us because of the cross? The cross changes everything, and the cross means everything, so it should never be minimized. It needs to be the foundation on which our life is built. Now, many live like the cross is just a story that they read in a book or a tale that somebody told them on Sunday, right? But we can't live that way. We need to live like we were right beside John and Mary at that foot of the cross, looking up at Jesus as he took our place for our guilt, for our shame, and for our sin. We need to live like we saw the love in his eyes when he said his work was finished, and he surrendered his spirit, and he bowed his head in peace. This is what carried the early church, and this is what needs to carry the church today. And that starts with our witness. It starts with our testimony, and it starts with our lives. We need to live every day with the cross in focus. Next week, we're going to look at the burial. We're going to look at the empty grave. We're going to look at the resurrection account in John's gospel. Because death was not the end of the story, right? Our God lives. Jesus lives. He reigns. And through his resurrection, he shows that he will once again return in his full glory, honor, and splendor. So the game plan next week is to cover chapters 20 and 21 and finish out John's gospel. So then we can move on to the epistles. So that is what is on deck for next week.